So 4 lads from Liverpool, 2 different groups. One's the Flock of Seagulls, one is the Beatles. One had 1 hit, and were known, if they're known at all, they're known for their weird hairstyles. The other continues to be an icon today, and actually, if you look at from 2000 to 2010, the Beatles outsold every other artist except for Eminem. So they remain staying power, and there's a reason for their staying power. And I think the things that made them a very powerful and strong team are the exact same characteristics that can make a startup team very powerful. One of the things they were very willing to do in their early days was be creative and flexible. They would do anything they had to win. We think of the Beatles as these iconoclastic hippies that did whatever the hell they wanted. That wasn't until they had made it. When they were on their way up, they conformed to the reality of the day. They wore suits, they sang yeah, 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 and they bowed at the end of their shows because they had to. They had very complementary talents. I think that is absolutely key in any successful team, understanding where that balance lies. Everyone knows that Paul was the melodic songwriter, John was the witty lyricist, George brought in the world beat, the raga. He brought a lot of diversity into their sound. And Ringo played the role of the average Joe. He was the person that the average person could look to and say, well, maybe I'm not as good looking as Paul, I'm not as smart as John, but hey, maybe I can sort of fantasize that I'm Ringo. They had a shared vision and a shared worldview. Your startup has to have the same thing. You can't sit in meetings and argue, what does the world look like? You have to agree that the world looks a certain way. And certainly the Beatles did. In the early 1960s, their worldview was music sucks, right? Elvis was in the army, Little Richard was a minister, Chuck Berry was in prison, and Jerry Lee Lewis was ostracized for marrying his 13-year-old cousin. So all of their idols were on the sidelines. And they decided to step in. These spotty-faced teenagers from Liverpool decided that they were going to be bigger than Elvis. And they believed it. They were the only 4 people on the planet that believed that they were going to be bigger than Elvis, and they pulled it off. And one of the reasons why they pulled it off is they had incredible mutual respect for each other. And what that allowed them to do is, when they were outside talking to the press, if you go back and read any of the old interviews, they say positive things about each other. Paul's amazing, he's the greatest bass player ever. Ringo is the best drummer, etc. They didn't take that into the studio, right? It wasn't Pollyanna where it was praising each other all the time. What they took into the studio was a passion and a desire to put out the best product possible. And because they had that mutual respect, they could fight like cats and dogs over a lyric or over a solo or over whether or not to use a certain instrumentation. And it was that mutual respect that allowed them to stay cohesive, yet to challenge each other to bring, for everybody to bring their A game into the studio every single day. I remember at some of my startups, I would have conversations with with the other core team members, and they would I'm passionately arguing for a certain position, which I didn't win. I would go out of that meeting, and immediately my team would converge on me and ask me, did we get it? Did we get whatever we wanted? And I had to basically turn back the arguments that had just been used against me on them, because it was important that externally I show cohesion with my team, whereas internally it was fine for me to show dissent. And that's what the Beatles certainly did. And I think lastly, every successful team has a strong supporting cast. We all like to think that we did it ourselves or the Beatles did it themselves. The reality is, without Brian Epstein as their manager, we would have never heard of them. Without George Martin as their producer, much of the innovation that they brought into the studio wouldn't have occurred, and we may not be listening to them 30 or 40 years later. So if you can emulate a team that you know a little bit about, whether it's the Beatles or a sports team, or maybe it's a team in fiction, look at the characteristics that made that team successful and attempt to bring those into your startup.